what particular importance do you think Bergdorf Goodman has in the community of retailing, Andrew?
At this moment?
Yeah.
Well, that's a sort of a loaded question, but with all due modesty, I think Bergdorf Goodman is probably the finest quality specialty store in the United States, possibly in the world, because, as you probably know, in Paris or in London or in Rome, I used to meet people socially and they'd say, well, now what is Bergdorf Goodman like compared to something in one of those major cities? And it really is impossible to do because business is done so differently in the United States than it is in Europe. For example, if a banker in New York City gets short notice that he has to go to a conference in London, Paris, and the wives are going, and his wife says, I have nothing to wear, and she's got 3 days to assemble a wardrobe, she can do it here. Not only here, but she could do it at Neiman Marcus, she could do it at I-Magnin, she could do it at Saks Fifth Avenue, at Marshall Field, where you can find hundreds of evening dresses in your size, of quality, well made, high fashion, or mink coats, or shoes, lingerie, in fact, everything you need. And in Europe, it's almost impossible to do that. You have to go to 8 or 9 different establishments to accomplish the same result.
Yes, there's no overall establishment at all. Then that particular community of retailing, Saks, Neiman Marcus, Magnins, and you, are really the only luxury businesses left, isn't that so?
Well, it's all changed tremendously. We used to have a very large custom-made business, and that was dropped quite a long time ago. First, we dropped custom-made dressmaking and tailoring because it was too unprofitable and embarrassing as well because the prices were exorbitant. And when you asked somebody $1,200 for a dress, they look at you as if you were a highwayman, and then at the end of the year you found you'd lost $250,000 despite those prices. It all got pretty silly. Then we went out of the custom millinery, which didn't hurt Mr. Halston any. He was our star millinery designers, one of our stars, and when we went out of the custom millinery, he started in for himself. There's an interesting side light on that too, because this was the era when Jessica Dobey was the millinery queen, and she was quite an amazing woman anyway. She had a fantastic style sense. Among other things, she discovered Pesanti, Dupioni, whatever you want to call it, in Italy, that marvelous raw rough silk, before anybody in the United States had it. And she actually was the first one to discover the Italian couture. I think that was in 1949 with Simonetta and Fabiani. But anyway, Jessica, we used to buy 150, 175 French model hats twice a year. And we made them for everybody. All the other stores out of town bought them. And we also did a lot of our own designing. And she engaged a young man by the name of Adolfo, who has done very well for himself too. But the reason that this is rather interesting is, first of all, Adolfo was Cuban. My wife is Cuban. And he was kind of unhappy because we wouldn't use his name. So he left. I think he went to Emmy, who would use his name. And then a couple of weeks later, Jessica came to me and said, I found a young man from Chicago by the name of Halston Frowick. And he's done hats for a few people out there, including Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. Fran, I forget her name now. Well, anyway, I met him and liked him, and we engaged him. And Jessica said, I think maybe we should use his name, because otherwise we might lose him the way we did Adolfo. And I said, it's all right with me. At that time, we were doing more custom millinery business than I think the next 4 or 5 people put together.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have any fears that anyone could entice him away. So he really got a break insofar as his name was used, and he had a fantastic, I'll give him credit for a lot of things, he had a fantastic manner with customers and with the press. And he was so accommodating that he built up a huge backlog of loyal friends, which helped him tremendously when he went in business for himself.
Adolfo and Halston are really your prize alumni, aren't they, in the fashion business?
You know, I'm trying to think. We had so many. You remember, Bob, you were
Oh, yes.
one of the great pioneers in the display world when you and Buckley were
Yeah,
here.
Jim Buckley.
That was quite a few years ago. But I remember, I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. You were the first people to show imagination and theatricality and make windows really interesting and attractive, like a miniature stage set rather than just simple mannequins showing clothes and shoes, which up to that time it really had been pretty much that way.
Well, there was an excitement about it. But another graduate of Bergdorf's was Bernie Newman, and he was started here as a window dresser, didn't he?
Well, his beginnings are really even funnier than that. He was a very good amateur dancer, and they used to have a lot of these sort of society benefit amateur theatricals, and Bernard was always the lead dancer. And my sister, Anne, knew him from these parties and things. And he was then the window dresser at Russack's, Fifth Avenue, when they were down around 36th Street, I think. And he wasn't too happy there, so he said, Anne, I'd like to meet your father, and maybe I can get a job at the store. Bergdorf Goodman then was much, much smaller. It was at 616 Fifth Avenue, between 49th and 50th Street, where the Rockefeller Center Gardens entrance is now. And we had one window, rather a large window, and a very pretty sort of rotunda behind it, a large square room. So they set up a date, and I think they had lunch together first at the old the garden at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel.
Oh, the one with the ducks swimming around, yeah.
Which was lovely. That was at Madison Avenue and 46th Street. And she said, Bernard, I can't take you to see Father. You get shaved. You look awful. He said, well, I was out late last night. I said, well, that doesn't make any difference. So she had to wait for him and went to the barber shop. Well, anyway, he got the job. And after about 3 weeks, Father was going out to lunch one day. He said, Bernard, I don't like that window. And instead of fawning and apologizing, he said, well, it's the best I can do with the merchandise that's available. Well, Father hit the roof and said, you think you could do better? He says, yes, I think I could do a lot better. He said, all right, let me see what you can do. So I think about less than 48 hours later, he brought about 25, 30 sketches to Father. And Father said, they're not bad. He says, we'll have them made up. And that was his start as a designer.
Where were they made up? In
I think they were made right in the store then.
Yeah. When,
in the workrooms.
Yeah. When Bergdorf started, there was no such thing as ready-to-wear, was there?
Very little. I wasn't around when Bergdorf started in 1901. I came in 1907, the same year as the Plaza Hotel, looking out the window here.
Well, they're pretty good-looking edifices.
But there was some ready-to-wear people then, but not in dresses. They were in blouses, skirts. In fact, one of the really old firms that's still in business is David Crystal.
Mm-hmm.
I think they started out making blouses and skirts. The first real ready-to-wear that I can remember started around 1924, 5, and 6. I I heard about it then because my sister was working then, and Bernard Newman was working. I think I started to work about 1926, and they were doing the buying then. And there were only a handful of good manufacturers, I mean, that had well-made, fine merchandise.
Do you remember their names?
Yeah, I remember one of them, excuse me, was Patou with Joe Copeland. And Joe Copeland is still going strong. She's not in business, but she looks fantastic, and
She
she's
does
all over
indeed.
town. And they had 3 designers there. They had a girl called Vera Jacobs and Zalma Golden. They could have sold about 20 times more than they could produce. And the big trick was to see Mr. Zipser and Mr. Immerman, the production manager, and Mr. Rubin, I remember, was the shipping manager, and sort of kid them along or buy them a lunch or a cigar to get some merchandise. And they were in 1412 Broadway. And there were a few others in that building. Well, I remember Shannon Rogers, for example, was at a house called, I always tease him about this. I think the house then was Herbert and Cooper. And we bought a black crepe evening dress with black fringe with a wide red suede sash about 6-7 inches wide. I think it was $39 wholesale, and I think we sold about 500 of that dress. We kept looking for a similar one the next year. And there was a dress at that time, too, that Patou made. They called it the spaghetti dress. It had loop fringe all around the collar and sort of a surplus to the waist. Well, I think that was the biggest selling dress up to that time in the history of the world, because it was copied down to as low as $6.75, $4.75 wholesale, and it sold at every price.
What were your duties when you started out in the store?
Well, I was rather badly trained. In those days, I think Father was so busy and he was sort of doing everything himself. I think he sort of told me, just get down on the floor and be useful. And I remember Mrs. Finucane, a saleswoman. She was an impoverished society woman. She was about 6'1", very handsome, beautifully coiffed. And she would practically grab people off Fifth Avenue to bring them in and sell them. But she was good. And I also remember that. This was, I guess, the fall of 1926. We were selling leopard coats then, out of stock, for $650. We also had a coat that was called the captive coat. It was from the famous play, The Captive, with Anna Andrews, written by...
Helen Mencken was in it.
Helen Mencken was in it, and it was very... The name of the playwright slips me. He was a Frenchman.
Yeah, Ventry or something. It was a big scandal.
But it created a lot of excitement because it had to do with lesbianism. And I think they tried to close it, and they didn't succeed, and of course then there were lines of people. Edward Bourdet was the name of the playwright. And in France it had been called La Prisonnière, over here it was called The Captive. And I think Henry Miller
Yes, he was the producer.
produced it.
And the coat was taken
There
from
was a coat in that, a shawl tuxedo. It was a tweed coat with either lynx or badger, going all the way around the neck, all the way down to the hem, and I think that coat sold around $145, $155, but we sell those literally by the thousands. And they came from Faber and Hine, from A. Bella. I think Philip Mangone was still in business then, or was in business then. He was in business later.
Yes, he was in business. And he
And
started
Klugman was in business,
Goodman, right.
with Omar Khayyam designing.
And Rentner, wasn't he?
Maurice Rentner was making mostly copies in that era. He hadn't become elegant yet.
I see.
He and his brother Harry.
Uh-huh. Now,
There was a very big shortage of good, ready-to-wear merchandise. In fact, that was another interesting thing from a merchandising point of view. We used to buy a tremendous amount of ready-to-wear in France then, because this was the era in the 20s when you had two seams, and there was no shape to the clothes. And in Paris, they had beautiful fabrics. They just sew them up, and we used to buy huge quantities. Remember, there's a firm called Germain Patou, P-A-T-A-T. But then, when Mr. Patou and the fashions changed, starting about, I was working for Patou then. Father took me out of college after my second year at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, sent me to Paris, and I went to work for Patou. And believe it or not, they're still in the same location on the Rue Saint-Florentin. And he was quite a man. He was quite a showman. And their evening openings were black tie, white tie, and were something that has never been seen really since that era. And everybody tried to be invited. And he really, I think, started in that era, the long dresses and the more fitted silhouette. And the reason that was really important to fashion, all of a sudden the French ready-to-wear industry couldn't keep up at all. They had no concept of pattern making, that detail. And then the American industry really started to take off.
Was it very different then than it is now? Because now the make is very good and standardized. But when in the beginning, I would imagine, there were troubles.
Well, in the old days, I remember quality control was awfully important, and my father particularly had a mania on that subject. In fact, we used to see every single dress, suit, coat, negligee on a living mannequin when it came in the store in the morning. And if it wasn't sized properly or finished properly, it went right back. And of course that, it would be impossible and impractical to do it now because the quantities are too big, but I can remember we were on the 5th floor then, the executive offices, my sister and my office and Father's office, and it was the first thing every morning. The models would come up and you'd put these clothes on and we'd okay them. And Father came out one day and said, "What's that?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "That dress doesn't fit the girl and I don't like it." I said, "Well, it's a David Crystal dress. It costs $16.75 and it's a size 20 and the girl is a size 8. He said, "It doesn't make any difference what price it is. The cheaper they are, the better they should be made, otherwise we shouldn't carry them." And well, I finally convinced him that there was nothing wrong with the dress. It was machine made, but it was made clean and neatly. In fact, some of the cheap things were made a lot better than some of the expensive things. Mainly because if David Crystal made a mistake on a dress, they'd sold 5,000 or 6,000 of, and they got them back, it was quite a beating. However, if Dietz Wurzba made a mistake on a suit which was individually made, it's one suit would come back, so it wasn't so serious. And frankly, some of the less expensive clothes were finished better and made better than the expensive ones.
Did your father actually go out into the market?
He went out a lot. In fact, I think he knew more about tailoring than anybody in the whole business, including the manufacturers, because he actually started when he quit high school. He went to work in Rochester for Stein Block in the menswear field, and he actually learned tailoring. He worked on the bench, was the expression then. And then he became impatient, and his family spoke to Mr. Stein, and they said, "Young man, if you want to get ahead in the fashion world quickly, you better go to New York, because there's a whole new industry developing in New York of doing tailored suits and coats for ladies." This was about 1899, 1900, I guess. So he came to New York, and I'm not sure what his first couple of jobs were, but
He worked for a place called Jackson's once, he told me.
He did?
Yeah.
He took his job with Bergdorf and Voight, V-O-I-G-H-T, I think, in about 1900. And he then, I think, borrowed money from his brother-in-law to be and bought out Mr. Voight and became Bergdorf Goodman in 1901.
He was about 24 at that time, right?
He was born in 1876, so he would have been about 25.
Yeah.
But then he always told me that the minute Mr. Bergdorf had a young partner, he would come in the morning, Mr. Bergdorf, and open the mail and take out the checks, go to the bank and go to the Liederkranz Club, which I think was on 58th Street, where the library is now, I believe, and play pinochle and drink beer all day. So then Father got up his courage, I guess, and he borrowed some money from his father-in-law to be and bought out Mr. Bergdorf. But he kept the name because it was a very good name even then. And I remember, no, I guess that was probably about 1903, I think, that he bought out Bergdorf. Mm-hmm. After it had become Bergdorf, because I remember him telling me they were married in 1903, mother and father, in June, and they went on their honeymoon on a buying trip to Europe. And they went naturally by boat, and Father said, I couldn't understand why everybody knew we were on our honeymoon, just because we had tailored suits made in the same fabric and steamer robes made in the same fabric. And he said before he left, their lease was up at 19th Street and 5th Avenue. And Father said, well, no matter what you do, Mr. Bergdorf, please move uptown and stay on 5th Avenue, because everything is going in that direction. Well, when he came back, he discovered that Mr. Bergdorf had taken a place at 32 West 32nd Street. And Father was furious, and I think that was the beginning of the end as far as their business relationship was concerned. I remember the place. It was pretty unattractive, because they were stuck there till 1914. It was a sort of a converted private house where you stepped down 2 or 3 steps.
Was it primarily a ladies' tailoring
It was
place?
The neighborhood was all right, I think, for retail, but it wasn't. The minute you got off 5th Avenue, it was less elegant, and but Father had some wonderful anecdotes about that period. He was quite shy, actually, and he used to actually fit the customers and fit the suits, and a lot of work was delivered to the tailors, and they worked at home. Father said he used to take a carriage on Friday night, Saturday, and take the fittings to the tailors, and they'd work on them over the weekend and bring them back on Monday. Then he also had some very good customers in Boston at the Lenox Hotel. He used to go. In fact, the Lenox Hotel is still there, I think, but it's not, I don't think it's elegant anymore. I really don't know enough about Boston, but this was the bustle era, and he was fitting, I think, one of the illustrious Mrs. Lodge's. And Father was quite shy, I should preface it with that. And he said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Lodge, but I can't fit you properly unless you remove your bustle. And she turned and said, young man, that is me, that is not a bustle. He said he never was more embarrassed in his life. He turned beet red, and he remembered the rest of his life.
Then when was the next move?
In 1914, they moved to 616 Fifth Avenue.
Actually, they built the building, didn't they?
No, I don't think. I really don't remember. I was 7 years old then. And the House of Flowers, Thorley was next door, and Ufflin Millinery were north, and Patrick the jeweler on that corner of 50th Street. DePinna was at the north side of 50th Street. The Tailored Woman was in that area too. And then of course Saks came along quite a bit later. I think Saks opened about 1924. I think the buildings existed, I'm not sure, and we occupied one, and then gradually we moved into the next building too. I think Upland kept the downstairs store part. Well, that all was finished about we moved in here in 1928. But we knew that we would have to get out because the Rockefeller Center was being planned for that whole area. And Columbia University owns all that land. I think Rockefeller Center has 99-year leases with renewals, but they don't actually own the land. And that was rather interesting because, again, he wanted to stay on Fifth Avenue and move up rather than down. But we did a lot of manufacturing then. And the zoning laws required you could only use 25% of the space in a new building for manufacturing, because they didn't want to turn Fifth Avenue into 7th Avenue or 8th Avenue. And there was very little available. However, in old building, the regulations did not apply retroactively. And so actually he took the corner of 52nd Street and Fifth Avenue on the northeast corner, which is now occupied by Japan Airlines, and then it was Hickson, which was a dressmaker tailoring outfit too. And he was very unhappy with it. It was full of columns and broken space, and I don't think he particularly liked the east side of the avenue either. And he was down in Bel Air, Florida, when Fred Brown came along and bought this property here where we are now, which was then the Vanderbilt Chateau, Cornelius Vanderbilt. And he envisioned having 7 or 8 elegant, smallish retail stores in separate buildings. And he wanted father to come in, and he was the landlord on 52nd Street too, so he said, I'll let you off 52nd Street if you take one of the corners on 57th or 58th Street. So father always tells the story. He did a lot of soul searching, and 57th Street was then a very good street. 58th Street was like going to Siberia. There was nothing on 58th Street commercially. And I think the price of 58th Street was less than 57th. So he finally talked himself into 58th Street. I think one of the chief reasons was the north light was very important for cutting furs in those days. And we always had our own. It was actually a separate corporation called the Bergdorf Goodman Fur Corporation. And that's kind of peculiar because a few years after we moved in, the advances in lighting eliminated the necessity. In fact, the last few years in the workrooms there, they cut off all the natural light, and they use only artificial light, which is truer because they can get daylight, they can get any effect they want. He also designed the store in such a way that if business was bad, he could use that large rotunda on 58th Street as an entrance and use the upper floors for the store and lease the stores on the main floor. Well, fortunately, his wisdom and perception paid off. I think the first year he was up here, which was he opened in March 1928, I think the business just about doubled, and he needed more space actually rather than less. But when we first moved up here, I guess we were on the corner, just the 58th Street corner. We had Tekla, the Pearl people. We had Marseille, the linen people. We had another Grande Maison de Blanc, also had linens. And I think Francis Klein was here, who was a very good dressmaker. Well, we at least had a year and a half before the crash of, I'm never sure if it's October or November 1929. And then Dobbs had taken the 57th Street corner. And the original concept, where the apartment entrance is, where we have the apartment on top of the store, that was supposed to be a public arcade, which came in from 58th Street, then made a left turn and then bisected two buildings on 57th Street. But when Dobbs decided they wanted to go on that corner, they didn't want two buildings, they wanted just the one building, so they had to eliminate the public arcade. But they had to use that wasted space to get to the apartment elevator, because that's set in about 100 feet from 58th Street. But Dobbs had the misfortune of opening about September 1929. They were here less than 2 months before the crash. But there were a lot of strange things then, because our lawyer was also the lawyer for Maurice Wertheim, who was the finance behind the Hat Corporation, which owned Dobbs. And they wanted a reduction in their rent, and they were willing to lose a few $100,000 because the whole Dobbs operation was really a prestige thing for their wholesale business of Knox and Dobbs. And Mr. Brown thought they were bluffing, I think, and he wouldn't give them any concession. He had already given us a concession on our, because we had a 21-year lease, and the building had been put up to our specifications, including the apartment. So they just went into bankruptcy on that corner on 57th Street, and that building was empty for 9 or 10 years till Mr. Denton, Tailored Woman, came in there.
Yes, it went Francis Klein, then Dobbs, and then it was empty when I came in 36.
Well, they used to beg us to use the windows for nothing,
Right.
just to call attention to the building and hopefully renting it. But then Mr. Brown went broke in the early 30s. But he had a comeback. I don't know all the details, but a few years later he came back far enough to present the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies with their building that they had on 47th Street. He just gave them that. They've since moved to larger quarters.
But actually, your father really single-handedly built the business, didn't he?
Yes, it was a very tiny business when he went in, I think.
It's far from tiny now.
Well, this year here in this store, we'll do about $44 million. And I think when we moved up here, it was the first year here in 1928, we were here 10 months of that year. I think it had gone from about 2 million to 4 million.
What difference did the Depression make, that fateful October 29?
Well, actually, that wasn't the worst year. I think the worst year was 1930 was bad, 1931 was bad. Mr. Roosevelt was elected in 1932. But we were fairly lucky. I don't think we actually lost money any one of those years. We didn't make much, but there was no terrible emergency or crisis.
Then
The business was very bad, generally speaking, till the war, we got on the war in 1941, but the manufacturers, business was just sort of stagnant. It wasn't moving. Because I remember when Nettie Rosenstein and Germaine Montiel, I never know if you say Montiel or Monte, They were by far the two best American fashion designers. And business was so poor, generally speaking, in the country that we could have had both of those lines exclusively if we had guaranteed them a minimum of $50,000 a year. And the Jonathan Logans and the Joan Leslies were small businesses. Everybody became a genius after the war. All the big pickups started in 1946, both retail and wholesale.
Well, actually, I think to get merchandise during the war, a lot of stores used designers' names and manufacturers' names, and actually put the business on the map. And including, I'm sure, Bergdorf as a
Well, his father died in 1953. That's 24 years ago. We were doing around $10 million. So actually, we've quadrupled the business since. There's a little more space, but it's still basically, we were able to get the Tailored Woman corner on 57th Street. I guess we got that in we started to use it actually for customers in 1968. About 9 years we've had that. And then we did a tremendous amount of changing. The Miss Bergdorf was the first big step in sort of widening the base and the appeal to a larger group of customers. That was 1955.
That created quite a sensation in the dress business, didn't it?
Yeah, well, it was very funny, too, because they gave us much more credit than we deserved for that. I think possibly we did it well, but I remember discussing it with Father. Everybody gave me credit for it, which I don't deserve, because he was perfectly willing to go into that market. Because we felt at that time that the clothes were sufficiently well made and high fashion to really be representative of our customers. They had not necessarily been that in the 30s and the early 40s. But his argument against it was he didn't want to do it in a small way, that unless there was sufficient space to do it in a large way, it didn't mean anything. And then we were, as you remember, I think, this office here, this whole floor were workrooms. We had the 6th, 7th, and 8th floors were all workrooms. And gradually we consolidated the workrooms and we cut down. We were able to get the space for Miss Bergdorf. And we had a lot of fun with that, actually. Miss Charlier was the buyer. She applied for the job 3 years before I opened the department. She was working at J. Thorpe. And then the other lady who had a sort of a junior type of department like that at Bendel's was called Young Timers. I forget her name now, but it was between those two, and finally we picked Miss Charlier. And I think we planned to do about $600,000 the first year, and I think the first year they did about $1.5 million, and then since then it's going way up, about $7 or $8 million on that floor. And then everybody copied the Miss idea. Even across the street, there's a Miss Bonwit and a Miss Bonwit Jr., but almost every city in the United States had a Miss Ranzoff or a Miss whatever it is. And the one who really used that name first, not in clothing, was Dior with a perfume, the Miss Dior. And we had all sorts of contests for the name, and I think George Kahn, who was quite a character too, who ran the stationery department and originally represented Casgrain, the stationers. I think he came up with the name. But then one of the silly stories about it, Miss Charlier was a real battler, and she'd rather buy and sell than practically breathe. She loved business, and she was darn good. And she was always asking for more space, and we just had no space to give her. Unfortunately, you can't stretch walls. You can do a lot of things and switching, but we used to have the blood bank here quite regularly every year, and I think that particular year we had it up in the apartment, and I was giving blood and she was giving blood, and my feet were next to her head. You know, they alternate you. And she used to always tease me because every time she talked to me about more space, I'd sort of walk away, because there was nothing I could do anyway. So she said, now I've got you. You've got to be here at least 15 minutes, and I have to have more space. And believe it or not, we were able to work out something to get us some more fitting rooms. So from then on, she kept bugging me that we had to keep giving blood, because every year she wanted more space. But that was interesting because Jerry Silverman, for example, who was a wonderful guy and a trustee of FIT, he attributes all his success to Miss Bergdorf, because he worked very closely with Miss Charlier. I didn't even realize he didn't start his business till 6 years after Miss Bergdorf started. So he started about 1961. But he was very enterprising, and he worked very closely. We had the clothes first, and we had ads, and we had windows, and they'd go, Jerry and his partner and designer, Shannon Rogers, they'd go to Europe together. We always insisted on paying for her trip so that there wouldn't be any conflict of interest. But they go to Rome, they go to Ireland, they go to Spain, and she really was the first one, too, to bring over exclusive foreign collections. The first one we had was Virginie in Paris, which we had exclusively. The clothes were made over there, and then we had them made here. Then she had Behania from Madrid, and she was always way ahead and very enterprising and very good planner.
To go back to your custom business, that was a very close relationship with Paris. And Ethel Franco started here when? 1914, I think, wasn't
That's
it?
right. She came, she was a very good friend. She and her sister, Aline Bernstein, and her husband, who was a Wall Street brother, she always lived with the Bernstein. They were very good friends of mother and father, and that whole family were talented. I think Aline Bernstein was actually born in the wings of a theater in London. And Gilbert Franco, the novelist, was related, and well, Ethel Franco she never married. She lived with her sister and brother-in-law, and she was embarrassed in the First World War because the stock exchange closed, I believe. And so her brother-in-law, was in a sort of a tight spot, and sort of kidding, semi-kidding on the level, she asked Father once if she'd like to work, if there was something she could do. And he had a sort of a stock answer for that. He had a fascinating theory. He said, sure, come in and we'll find something for you, and you make your own job. And he believed in that. He had a couple of strange theories. That one worked out well. Like cream coming to the top of the milk bottle before we had homogenized milk, that if somebody really wanted to get ahead and had talent, they could really make their own spot. Things were not as regimented as they are now, where you have rules of work that you have to do this and report to that. And he had another strange theory, which I don't subscribe to, but it worked out in that era, of having two heads to a department and having competition. Like we had it here with Mr. Feldman and Mr. Singer in the fur department. We had it in the millinery with Jessica and with Mrs. Brandeis. I never could subscribe to that too well, because one of them would always sort of, it's the old theory, if you gave 10 people $1 million, 20 years from now, one of them would have done very well, and maybe a couple badly, and a couple of them would have lost everything. That always the talent will rise if they're given an opportunity.
There was only one head, really, to the custom department, though, wasn't there?
Oh, Miss Franco she was really an amazing woman. And she had beautiful taste, beautiful manners, fantastic memory. She used to go to those collections because she prided herself a little bit. She had a few kind of cute peculiarities. She would never take a number, even if the collection were 200 pieces, which they used to be in those days. And because I was busy, and my sister was writing, I used to tease my sister. She'd take so many numbers, I'd say, you think you're working for women's wear. You can't buy them all, so why do you write them all down? Well, I think it kept her awake, which is more than some of our friends. Like Toby. Toby used to always sleep through every collection. But if there was anything new or good, she was awake. And even little Stella was like that for a while. The minute the good dress would come out, that she'd have a message from God or something, she'd wake up. But Ethel was, I traveled with Ethel when I was about 19 years old, because she was a close friend of the family, and I was spending some time in Europe. And so the family decided I should travel with her and get a little culture in Vienna and in Germany and different places. And we got along very well. We had a system. I'd say goodnight to her about 10 o'clock, and then I would sneak out on the town in Berlin or in Vienna and find out what was going on. In those days, there was quite a lot going on.
You also must have had quite a few customers in that department in the early days.
Customers from
New York. Who were they? What kind?
Well, we had a lot of. I think we've had everybody in the world, really, in the haute monde, from queens to courtesans to society to some very amazing ones. We had, I think the biggest customer we ever had was Lorraine Manville, Dresselheis, the Johns Manville family, the sister of Tommy Manville. I don't think any of them are alive now, so they can't sue me for slander or libel. Well, Tommy Manville, as has been documented, was, I think he had 13 wives, 2 or 3 of them twice. But his sister was just the opposite. She was charming, very quiet, very lovely person. But she had a passionate love for clothes. And I remember one year, and she was very generous, I remember one year she was going to London in June for Ascot and the Derby, and in those days we had about 7 designers in custom made, as well as the French models. And we had made, I don't know, a couple of 100 outfits for her. And when I say outfits, include shoes, bags, fur piece, gloves, all the accessories. And I think when she left, she gave $47,000 in tips to the people in the store. Of course, the saleswomen and the fitters got a lot, but every tailor, every dressmaker, every presser, every elevator boy, every delivery boy got a very generous gift. But then she gets to London. She's there about a week, and we get a cable as follows. I'm desperately in need of clothes. Need 6 navy, 6 white, 6 black, 6 gray outfits. Well, we really sort of threw up our hands and
You want to stop?
5 minutes.
By and watch my finger.
All right, back to Mrs. Dresselheis and the cable.
well, she wanted these outfits desperately. You'd think that she was in a nudist colony or something. And we finally managed. And I was saying, I remember the saleswoman was a lovely English-born lady named Mrs. Courage, who was a fantastic saleswoman, but she ended up as a very pathetic alcoholic. In fact, I remember Life magazine doing a story on alcoholics, and her picture was in there. Of course, there were no names used, but she was sitting in a bar at 4 o'clock in the morning someplace. But there have been some very interesting and amazing customers. We had another one that we used to call Madame God. I think when she was with us, she was Mrs. Vettelson. She was the Monel metal heiress. And she was very imperious and very demanding and very well organized, but a terrific customer. She had 2 of everything, but she didn't like to pack. So if she ordered 25 custom-made outfits, she would order 50 so that she could have a duplicate wardrobe in England. But she also, I remember she She knew exactly what she wanted. In lingerie, she'd want a certain type silk, a certain color, and then you'd get her the silk, and then you'd get an order for $18,000, $20,000 for lingerie. And then her bills had to come by departments. She wanted a separate bill from the lingerie, a separate one from negligees, a separate one from hosiery, from shoes. Of course, we were delighted to do that. And this is before computers, but we would have done anything for her. And another wonderful one we had was, it's a cute story, was a Mrs. Fraser. I don't really remember where her money came from, but there's so much money in the world these days, and people that none of us have ever heard of that practice anonymity, that have publicity men to keep them out of the paper instead of put them in. And we're always amazed when somebody buys a $50,000 sable coat and nobody's ever heard of them, and then you find out that they own 500,000 acres in the Midwest and or mining interests or something. But this particular Mrs. Fraser was a nut on germs and bacteria. And in fact, she wouldn't let Father go near her because Father had a mustache. That was unsanitary. She literally went to the workrooms to pick her fitter and to pick the girls who could work on her things. And she would call, her maid would pick up the clothes. Nobody in the shipping room could handle them. They had to go to the 58th Street door on a hanger, and then they would be picked up. But this one particular day, she was interested in a mink coat. And these are the days of Labrador mink, wild Canadian mink, which ran in the $15,000 to $20,000. And Mr. Singer, who was, I guess, the only partner Father ever had, he ran the Fur Corporation, which was a separate company. He sent somebody to the corner drugstore, and they brought back, remember the old days of the big rolls of cotton wrapped in the blue paper? And he took all the cotton and put it in a great big box, and he put the mink skins on the cotton, and he got an order for $20,000 immediately. So that was very good salesmanship. Oh, but there have been lots of amazing ones. There was another wonderful story about Mrs. Madeline Force Dick Fiamonte. She remember she was married to the prize fighter Fiamonte, and I think she was living at the Plaza then. And she had had a scene in here one day, and Father was very, I think maybe the whole family philosophy. We enjoyed the business, and we loved our employees, and it was really a family affair, and making the last dollar or penny or nickel was not the most important thing in the world. And she was in a temper in a fitting room near the fur department and ended up by jumping up and down on some sables. And of course the salesman was in tears, and Father just very politely took her by the arm and said, "Mrs. Fiamonte, evidently you're not very happy here because you can't be very pleasant for you to lose your temper and go into a tantrum, and you certainly aren't making our employees happy. So I suggest that you trade elsewhere in the future." And he took her to the elevator and out. In those days, we had one window dresser, Henry Thimmel, very nice young man. I know he was Scandinavian. I think he may have been Swedish. And we had windows then were one figure, I believe headless, yes, headless figure with a coat or a dress, and the windows were open, and you could go in and out during the day if somebody insisted on having, it wasn't any major production, which is now to dismantle a window to get something out. It's quite a job. So Mrs. Fiamonte comes in, and I remember exactly, we had purple and royal blue cloth coats in the window with natural Norwegian blue fox collars, which were fairly new then. And they ran $800, $900, and she loved one of the coats. And she goes up to this young man and said, "I'd like to see the coat in the window." And he took it out, and she looked in front of her. They weren't selling coats on that floor. I guess there were mirrors then in the millinery. And she asked the price, I think it was $900. She peels off the $900. It was even before sales tax. And he said, well, can I wrap it or put it in a box? She says, oh, no, I'll teach that Mr. Goodman a lesson. He doesn't think I should come in the store anymore. He says, I'll walk right out with it on my arm. And she took it on her arm over to the plaza. So we were joking at the time that we wish we had a few hundred other customers like that. No alterations, no examining, no boxes, nothing at all.
What kind of volume did that custom business get up to, Andrew?
Well, it was very strange because the volume never really changed much. Because what happened, in the early 30s, we would make a coat or a suit to order for $195 right here on the premises. And then gradually through the years, prices went sky high, and I think really in those days, I don't think the custom-made business dressmaking ever went over about $1.5 million. And when we closed it down, it was doing $1.2 million, but then we were selling 1,000 units, and probably in the early years, we were probably selling 5,000 units.
What do you think caused that business to fade?
Well, it wasn't so much that it faded, it was just so unprofitable. Because you really, doing custom-made legitimately, you had to have very good fitters, both tailors and dressmakers who were very well paid, and you had the drapers and the finishers and the shopping department, and you would make up your first fitting, and then there would be a second fitting, and then there would be a third fitting, and you were putting in labor with all these fittings and changes that was like making 4 or 5 garments. And then the other phase of it that was very impractical, these clothes were copied exactly the way they were shown in mostly Paris. We did have some Italian, some English, other years. Well, we would buy, when you buy in those days from V&A or Dior or whoever it was, you would get a reference. They would tell you when you buy a model, and of course they always gave them names instead of numbers. Let's say it was Argentinaise, 5.5 yards of velvet that you got from Bianchini, 2.5 yards of lace. They give you the name of the lace house, and the buttons, and the artificial flower, and the material in the slip or the petticoat. And the whole thing was so stupid because, first of all, the French go on vacation in August. So you couldn't get anything in August. Everybody's on vacation. They still do that in France. And when customers wanted those things and were willing to pay those prices, they wanted them as near Labor Day as possible when you showed the models. And then the prices were getting, at the end, I remember they would charge you $50 a yard for plain silk chiffon. And if you wanted that particular color, you had to do it. And then you never knew if you needed, if you were going to copy a dress 20 times or 3 times. By rule of thumb, we used to order 4 of everything, at least for 4 copies, and then if we needed more, we'd reorder. But if you didn't sell them, then you were stuck with those fabrics too.
Were you part of the union drive in the early 30s here?
Well, we've always had, when I was a little boy, I remember, we used to have strikes and threats of strikes in the tailoring quite often. We only had the tailors. I think the tailors and the presses were unionized then. And the dressmakers were not. The milliners never were. But I remember about 1932 when Franklin Roosevelt was elected for the first time, and Mrs. Roosevelt was very active, sort of pro-labor and pro-the masses. They tried very hard to organize the women. And the climate was such in the middle of that depression and the bank holiday that you really couldn't buck it. So we did, the women were then organized. And I don't think that made an awful lot of difference, really, because if you had a union shop or a non-union shop in this area, I'm not talking about sweatshops, in order to keep them out of the union, you'd pay them at least the union scale or better, so really that part didn't make much difference. But there were a few bad features. One was the equal distribution of work, where if you had one girl that was not performing well and not, you couldn't lay her off. If you wanted to lay off, let's say you had a workroom of 100 dressmakers, if you wanted to lay 10 off, the union would lay 10 off, but they would do the selecting on the theory that it was an equal distribution of work. And it was really tough in those days. I remember Mr. Harrison of Stein and Blaine was a very fine house once. They actually had pictures, and they caught a tailor sewing for 3 hours with no thread in the needle. He was just sitting there going through the motions. And when they tried to have him discharged for that, they came back and said that the foreman was prejudiced against him, and there was... You were married to anybody that you had after you kept them for whatever the 6 months or years trial period.
Did Mr. Dubinsky and your father ever come eyeball to eyeball?
Oh, yes, I remember... well, I can remember going back. Father took me to a negotiating session once with, I think it was Schlesinger, who was one of the toughest men the ILGW ever had and one of the most famous negotiators. And I was fascinated because nothing got any place. And I remember Father telling me, he gave me some very good bits of advice about... He said, never sit in on a negotiating session yourself with a union, because then there is no court of last resort. You can't say, I'm going to go home and speak to myself. But if you have someone do it for you, they can always have to confer with you. And he says, not only that, but their stock and trade is to drive you crazy and to wear you down. And unless you're an experienced negotiator, you'll just give in from sheer exhaustion. The other good bit of advice he told me once was never speak to the Internal Revenue people yourself. Have your accountants do it or have your treasurer do it, but don't get involved. Those were good pieces of advice. But one of the things that amused me about the Roosevelt family is that there was a time there, I think just before we got into the war, where the government was trying to stop luxury businesses, stop inflation, and you weren't supposed to... You're supposed to put all your money in savings bonds, defense bonds, and I remember Mrs. Roosevelt actually coming out on the radio and saying you shouldn't patronize Bergdorf Goodman, Hattie Carnegie, Bonwatella, Saks, Milgram's, etc. And it was particularly annoying then because Mr. Roosevelt spent every weekend on the Nourmahal on Vincent Astor's yacht. So he wasn't so allergic to wealth at that time. But he was a very good politician. And then there was also that period when Brenda Fraser had her coming out party, and they spent $50,000, I think, which was unheard of at that time. I think she probably came out around 1937 or 8, I'd say, around that period. And there was a lot of editorials against it, and then finally people started to realize that if everybody did that, it would be marvelous, because it helped the photographers and the florists and the waiters and the food people and the liquor people. And I mean, spending money never hurt anybody. The only people that suffer is like the old days in France when they put the money under a mattress or put it in the ground, which helped no one. But I mean, if you put your money in a savings account or in a savings and loan or in a bank or in securities, it can be used for the benefit of the overall economy.
Certainly this is one of the more expensive stores in the world.
Yes, I think so.
And
But,
sorry.
you know, I guess you use the word expensive. I guess that's all right. But, you know, quality and price, the old cliche is true. If you buy something, a mink coat for $5,000 that is good and lasts you for 10 years, it's much cheaper than buying one for $3,000 that falls apart and you can only use for 2 years. So, I mean, there are two sides to that coin, and price alone really doesn't represent value.
What particular departments in the store are consistent money makers?
Well, almost all of them nowadays do very well. In the old days, the fur department was outstanding. And historically, foundation departments have always been big money makers, but we never had a very large one. We never had the space for it. But one of the reasons for that is that the styles don't change that rapidly, so you don't have a terrible markdown situation.
What kind of arrangement I see the Givenchy shop? Is that semi-custom?
No, that's pure ready to wear. And in fact, he has in Paris another sort of ready to wear in his own store, or his own shop, I should say, on the Avenue George V, where I think when things are a little quiet, he makes things up in his own workroom. And they're quite expensive, and you get one fitting with them, but they're not complete couture. But the things in the Givenchy Nouvelle Boutique are manufactured, regular workrooms, and just sold in sizes plus alterations.
What about your menswear business, Andrew?
Well, that's developing. We're quite new to, I think we've only had men's clothing, suits, coats, and things for about 5 years. It's coming along quite well. For a while we didn't even have a buyer or a merchandise manager in there. Now we have good people in there, and I think it will do very well.
It looks like a very active department. It must be building.
Well, we do better, relatively speaking, in the furnishings on the main floor than we do in the suits and coats on the second floor. But I think it has a big potential growth. Men are becoming more like peacocks these days. They're as vain as the women, and a few years ago they were dressing more colorfully than the women were.
What about, for instance, the men's fur department?
Well, that was very interesting this year. I think it's the first time that a young designer, this fellow Jeffrey Banks, who's a young black boy and very talented, he's only about 23, and he made a whole collection of furs just for men. In fact, I don't think he does any women's furs. And we thought they were really outstanding, in good taste, and the kind of things that anybody would wear, not theatrical, not just Walt Frazier's or Joe Namath's sport figures. And we've done quite well with it. We didn't go into it in a tremendous way.
The fur department is no longer the Bergdorf Goodman Fur Corporation, is it?
Well, we still have the Bergdorf Goodman Fur Corporation. I don't exactly know why, some legal, technical reasons, but we don't do very much manufacturing the way we used to do, because that got to be very expensive too. It's such a seasonal business. And we were so conscious of quality, both in skins and workmanship, that it was not a huge volume. We did do very well with the Japanese. I think we were the first people to sell fine furs to the Japanese, and we're still doing it. We're doing it with a different large firm now. And they're trying very hard in Japan to get the affluent people to be more fur conscious on quality furs. They've always been interested in inexpensive shearlings and muskrat and things like that, lapin.
And it's still a big moneymaker, that department.
Yeah, the volume is way up there. We have this Yves Saint Laurent furs now too. But another strange thing that we're doing now is we buy the couture models in Paris. In fact, we're the only ones in the United States, I think, that are buying them, wholesale or retail. And this is completely a public relations prestige operation. We sell them at cost. And of course the cost is pretty high by the time you figure the Saint Laurent. We only buy them from Saint Laurent, Givenchy, and Dior. And I think this year a couple from Chanel. But by the time you pay the Paris price, plus the duty, plus the shipping, handling, insurance, selling them at cost even is, a lot of them sell $5,000–6,000. But the publicity on it has been very strong, and when we have that show, everybody in the whole fashion world, magazines, people from the museums, come in to see it because it's sort of a dying art, and those things are really magnificently made.
What do you see as the future of luxury merchandising, really?
Oh, I think if you go back through history, there's always a demand for fine quality luxury merchandise. Even in the midst of revolutions in France, there were some luxury firms that flourished. Plus, it's a more limited audience. But that's changed tremendously now, too. I remember years ago getting a lot of pressure from the Daily News and from other media that we should advertise that they had. I think the News in those days had a circulation around 4 million on Sunday. I think this was probably around 1939 or 40, and at that time I got some statistics which were accurate, and it showed, I think, in the whole United States there were less than 50,000 people with incomes, I believe then, at over $25,000 a year. These were government figures given from the tax records and all. So when one of these glib salesmen would come in and tell you about his circulation, we'd sort of say, well, we're not interested in quantity circulation, we're interested in pinpointing the potential quality people. And that's why a magazine like the New Yorker has stood up for more than 50 years, and they've never swerved really from their original concept, and they're still doing extremely well. I think the last issue of the New Yorker had 287 pages, and their editorial matter is quite limited. But they've built up, it's interesting too, I don't think many people realize, they were very selective in what advertising they would accept. They would never take foundation ads or bras, for example. I'm not sure if they would never take supposed wholesale furriers on 7th Avenue who do 90% of their business at retail. And for that reason, I of course love it. And I think the advertising in it is almost as interesting as the text, but the quality of writing is superior.
What part of your budget is advertising these days?
Well, under our new regime, Mr. Niemark and Carter Hawley Hale, which is now 5 years, Mr. Niemark was here almost 3 years, there have been changes in emphasis. The total advertising budget, I think, is down. We're doing more direct mail, which is very productive, and we do a tremendous amount in the New York Times. We do less than we used to do in the fashion magazines. We still use them, but not as much as we did before. I think our budget in interior and window display is way up, too.
After 70 years of independence, what was the advantage of going into Carter Hawley Hale?
Well, that really was sort of a labor of love on my part for the sake of the business, to continue the business, because I had no family in here that were interested. And I was approaching 70, and you never know if you're going to live to be 90 or if you're going to drop dead when you're 50 or 60. And the only way I could really see guaranteeing the continuation of the business was to merge with a large, publicly financed corporate entity. And it's worked out very well. I think, for all concerned. It also eliminated a very unpleasant tax potential in a family business. Say the government comes in and tells you that the stock was in your estate is worth $10 million, and where are you supposed to get the 10, let's say the tax is 5 or 6 million, where are you supposed to get the, if you have to pay in cash? Very often businesses have to be liquidated in order to pay the estate taxes. And they're quite arbitrary as to deciding what the stock is worth. When Father died, he had also been very far-sighted. He had no interest at all in the real estate, because we own the real estate and we lease it, when I say we, the family, and lease it to Bergdorf Goodman. It's on a percentage lease. And when he died, he had no interest in the real estate company. It was my mother and sister and myself. But we received a very fair valuation, I think, at that time on Father's stock.
Now, you are still listed as janitor in the corporation to occupy the apartment upstairs?
I don't really know. That's an old story, and it's rather an amusing story. But I've never found a lawyer yet that would verify the municipal law, whether it was true or not. Supposedly, in a factory building, which this is, the only person that's allowed to live there is the superintendent or the janitor. And I've tried to check it out and see the actual law. I've never found a lawyer that really knew it, but it made a good story anyway. And I remember Walter Winchell in his heyday, when he had a huge following. About once a year he'd do a column, Things I Never Knew About New York, and one of them was always the Goodman family of Bergdorf Goodman are probably the wealthiest janitors in New York, because they live over the Bergdorf Goodman and all this. But the apartment is completely fireproof. Now this office, the wood paneling, I think is beautiful, and it's the kind you can't even get anymore, because I think it's called distressed walnut. But the detailing on it is, it's like the carving, the stone carving in some of these old apartment houses. It just would be so prohibitive, even if you could find the workmen who know how to do it. But I think behind these walls you have asbestos, and we were permitted to do it. But when we built the apartment in 1928, the living room up there, which looks like wood, is all painted to look like wood, and the floors are all either terrazzo or concrete. The doors are metal. The fire alarm is in the hall, and a hose. So everything is...
You're really set up for a factory.
Yeah, for fireproof purposes, which is fine.
Can you, well, I don't mean necessarily capsule, but what kind of man was your father? What was your impression of him, looking back?
Well, he was quite a guy. I'm often rather interested in my wife's reaction to him. My wife was born in Spain, and I met her in Cuba. She was educated really in Boston, because her brothers, one of them went to Harvard, and others went to prep school there, so she spoke very good English. We've been married 42 years, and she was crazy about Father, and she often brings up the fact he was a self-made man, but that he had tremendous taste and dignity, and I guess you have to use the word class to simplify it. And we sometimes, I think it's very interesting to study self-made men, because some of them never become sophisticated or get rid of their complexes and have chips on their shoulders, and others learn and improve and grow every single day. I remember we were at a dinner party in London with Eddie Rain, who owns the Delman Shoe Departments, which used to be part of Genesco, which are now Debenhams, an English firm. And Ed Carter was there, who was the chairman of the board of Carter Hawley Hale, which is a very large, successful merchandising company. I guess now their volume is about $1,600,000,000. If they get Marshall Field, which they've just made their tender offer for, it could be up around $2 billion, 3 or 4 within the next couple of years. But anyway, we were discussing some people, and my wife was making an excuse for someone who didn't always behave so well. He was rather gauche, and she turned to Mr. Carter and said, "Well, Ed, you know, he's a self-made man." With that, Mr. Carter said, "Well, I'm a self-made man." And she turned it around very well and very quickly and said, "Yes, but you're the kind of self-made man who learns and improves every single day and every single month and every single year." So that pleased him, which is true. When Ed Carter graduated from University of Southern California, where he worked his way through, he worked for about 2 years, I believe, at Silverwood's, a men's store out in California, to get enough money to go to Harvard Business School. And he did extremely well at Harvard, I think top of his class. And then he went to work for the May Company. And David May, the son of the founding family, wanted him to be president of the May Company at that time, and it didn't turn out. And I think David was rather upset. I heard he didn't go to a board meeting for about 2 years. And then Mr. Carter took this opportunity. He took the presidency of the Broadway, which was then doing all of $25 million worth of business in 1946. And he's a very shrewd financial man, very bright. He's got a mind like a computer. And he got all sorts of stock options, and he built that $25 million business into the $1,600,000,000 business now. A little over 30 years, which is quite an achievement.
Your father was, at least as my memory of him was, quite a figure of authority as far as the business was concerned.
Well, he was, you can see his picture there. He was very handsome, he was very meticulous, he was very well groomed, he was, till you knew him, you thought he was quite severe, but actually he was the biggest pushover that ever lived. Anybody that came to him with a hard luck story, he helped everyone, and he'd sort of say, "Don't tell him that I helped you." But he had a tremendous heart, and he's helped loads of people when they were really in trouble, and never particularly wanted it publicized. He was basically shy, believe it or not. I remember when he was honored, sometimes he couldn't get out of it. At some charity function, he would perspire and fret about the speech he'd have to make, and it really bothered him. He didn't particularly like being in the public eye that way. But he was a perfectionist. He had his finger on every single thing that was going on in the store, because you could do it a little more easily then. And I remember even he would have his suits made to order, and I think for a while we went to the same tailor, and if there was a quarter of an inch off in a lapel, or the collar went off in the back, he would bring that suit back 5 or 6 times till it was absolutely perfect. And nobody really minded, because he was one of the few people in the retail business that knew what he was talking about, that knew fit and style and shape. And then that's another thing interesting to mention. You asked before if he went in the market very often. He did. I remember there was a firm called Ben Gershel coat and suit house. And they made a good product, but there wasn't much imagination. And the man that ran it actually was a man called Mo Selinsky. And he was married to a Follies girl. But he was very smart, and Father would go down there and he'd rip the fur collars off and show him how to put it on right, and he would design this, and of course Father designed a lot. He always had 5 or 6 sketches, girls, in the house, and he designed all the furs. He'd have an idea, and he'd bring, I remember the top sketcher was a Miss Zugi, who was terrific, and he'd describe to her what he wanted, and she'd make 5 or 6 variations of what he had in mind. And after you work with someone for a long time, they sort of can read your mind, understand what you want. And then he would have the muslin made and actually the furs made up. And down at Gershel, I think for a while there, we were doing about $85,000, $90,000 a month with them. And the things, of course, were exclusive. What they did with them the next year was their own business. And then he did the same thing with a firm called Lito
Cohn
Labalbo, Martin Cole. And they did exactly what he wanted, and he developed a tremendous business with them. So he could get the kind of exclusive merchandise that he thought was right. But I think one of the sad things about business these days is that there is very little quality control. And I see things in the window. I'm not talking about cheap things. Sometimes expensive dresses that $800 and $900 retail that are so badly made that he must be turning over in his grave, because he would never have allowed them. But now if you get that fussy, you wouldn't have any merchandise.
Who would you say were your best suppliers, or do you?
Well, frankly, I think that's one reason that we've taken a very strong position on imports now. We feel in ready-to-wear that the Italian market, particularly Milan, is stronger than Paris, or stronger than any other place. There's tremendous imagination and originality. And I think the best-made clothes in the world at the moment are made by Mila Schön, who is German, who works in Milan. Her clothes are so magnificently made. They remind me of Norel, when Norel clothes were beautifully made, and he was a perfectionist too, because the prices were high. But you could wear a Norel suit, a woman could wear a Norel suit for 15, 20 years, and it would... Another amazing thing about Norel, and this whole design concept, he was really not a creative designer. In fact, I remember one year in his publicity blurb that they hand out when you go to see the collection, he said specifically, I'm showing Chanel-type suits. So, I mean, he was a great editor, a great colorist, a perfectionist as far as workmanship was concerned. And then I remember another year he showed I think he was the first one in the better end merchandise to show a culotte. And it was beautifully cut. And he gave it, after the first season, he gave the patent to everybody in the industry. He figured he couldn't stand seeing bad ones all over the street. And he wasn't a very selfish businessman anyway. He was more of a creative artist. And he just put the patent in the public domain, as it were. I think probably they would have stolen it anyway.
Who were your acquaintances or friends in the couture in Paris?
Well, I still see Mr. Barbas, who is the head of Patou. It's funny, when I was working there when I was 19 years old, he was married to Patou's sister. And I don't think Mr. Patou was 100% pleased with that match. And I remember he never even came to the Rue Saint-Florentin. He was on the Rue Saint-Roch, where they had the farm workroom and the perfume business. And of course, Patou died very, very young. I think he was only 45 years old. But another interesting thing about Patou in that era, He was a terrific showman. He was a very attractive man. He was a passionate womanizer. And he did something very clever. He brought over the American mannequins every year. He'd bring over 4 or 5 girls, and if you study the history of those girls, it's really interesting. They married extremely well. A lot of them married titles. Some of them became mistresses to extremely wealthy men. But it was a very good stroke of showmanship, and everybody was buzzing about the girls and about who their romance was.
Seems to me I remember that you got into some shenanigans with the police when you were at Patou.
Yeah, that was kind of an amusing story, actually. In those days, the couture original designs were pretty well protected by the French government, and the copyists were really like bootleggers. And I'd been there about a month when I remember Mr. George was the manager, and he asked me one day if I would do them a favor, and I said sure, because he was nice enough to give me the job. And incidentally, the people at Patou couldn't understand what I was doing there at all. They thought I was a spy, and I was going to steal all their secrets. Not Mr. Patou, but the people in lower echelon jobs. And so he told me, I said, what would you like? He said, well, we're trying to catch some copyists, and we'd like you. We've taken an apartment for you at the Hotel Donu on the Rue Donu, across the street from Harry's Bar, sort of a second-rate hotel, or third-rate, I guess. And your name is Mr. Bosque, B-O-S-Q-U-E, I think. And these people will come to see you about 5:30. So I'm all of 19 years old, feeling as if I'm in the middle of a big spy story or something. 2 detectives arrived before I did. One got under the bed and one got behind the shower curtain. And then these people came in. I remember there were 2 women and I think 2 men, and they had all these French models. They had a mannequin with them too. They dressed up, and they showed me Patou's dresses and Viennese dresses and Boulanger and Chanel, I think at that. Yeah, Chanel was still in business. This is 1927. And I said, well, how do I know that, they're original models of Patou and Chanel? And how do you get them? He said, well, we have people in the workrooms that we pay off, and they are legitimate, and we've got the labels and everything else. And then he started quoting the prices, which were very reasonable because they were all copies. And things were much cheaper in 1927. So I'm writing an order. I buy 4 of this style, and 6 of this style, and 5 of this style. And then we got to the end of the order, and I gave him, we were the Maison Willy Rosambert, Commissionaire, Contremarque, 380. And I said I'd like them shipped on the boat sailing on the 30th of February. I think by that time I was a little nervous, and I thought they'd stretched February from 28 days to 30. With that, the detectives figured that I'd done enough, and they came out and made the arrest. And I think one of them went to jail, and 2 or 3 of them were fined quite a lot. So they were very appreciative. And I didn't need a bodyguard then, because people weren't quite as tough as they are nowadays. If somebody asked me to do that now, I don't think I'd do it. I might end up with 9 slugs in my back or something.
Obviously, you and your father had considerable interest in youth. I mean, the Edwin Goodman chair at FIT is by way of a very handsome gift. What would be your feeling about the chances for youth in this retailing business?
Well, I think they're tremendous. People used to make fun of retailing because they didn't like the 6-day week, which is now 7 days. They didn't like working at nights. And the good stores, like the big ones, they were expanding, like Bloomingdale's, Federated, owned by Federated. They would interview the top kids who graduated from Harvard Business School and Stanford and the other good business schools, and they didn't get very many recruits. They'd rather go to the oil companies or the AT&Ts or the IBMs. And I never really could understand it, because I agree with that theory that if you have some ability, it will show and you can get places. And then you take some of the success stories in retailing. There are a lot of them. David Unich was president of Macy's when he was 37. Andy Arena, who just got this fantastic job, probably the greatest job in the history of retailing at Marshall Field, is 49. Marvin Traub became president over at Bloomingdale's, I think, when he was about 46 or 7. And there are great opportunities. You don't have to wait till everybody else dies or is transferred. Or
You feel the business is expanding?
And I also feel that women have had a marvelous break in the fashion world, probably better than any other overall industry. Well, of course, in the magazine world, they've always done very well. The editors, all the way back to Mrs. Edna Woolman Chase and Carmel Snow. But even in retailing, you've got Jerry Stutz, you had Mildred Custon heading up Baumwitz, you had Dorothy Shaver running Lord & Taylor. And your fashion directors and top buyers, and a lot of the merchants are women. You've got Gigi Michelson down at Macy's, who's a lovely person, has done a very good job. I think there's a great opportunities. I was interested to read this morning where Stanford was voted the finest business school in the country over Harvard. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
By graduates of business schools, I think, by a very good peer group. And they sort of ranked them according to what these people thought who had graduated.
Of course, one of the things that's happened recently is that the business has become increasingly colorblind. I mean, Steve Burrows and your fur man, they've moved into the designing business quite well, I think.
Well, I think you have a interesting situation going on now. I don't know how long it'll go on, because I think that this licensing business is developed to the point where people are trying to do so much that they can't do it all well. There's too much proliferation. The one that really started the licensing thing was Christian Dior. Now, he died in 1957, and but he was such a sweet man and so conscientious that he really looked at the neckties his name was on, and the shirts, and the dresses and the ready-to-wear, and unfortunately he died very young. But then you had just the opposite with Schiaparelli. She just sold her name, and they were making shower curtains, stationery, furniture, and very little of that survived because it had no merit behind it. It was just a name without any supervision. And you take Halston, because he sold out to Norton Simon, and now they're using him for everything. He's making, you name it, he's making it. And I just don't think that anybody can cut himself into that many pieces and do it well.
And
It's
not
almost
keep control of the quality or of the product.
He's done pretty well so far, and then I think you confuse the public too. If I were a woman, and his couture line, the dress is $900 or $1,000, I don't think I'd be too happy when you can buy a blouse or a skirt on the department floor below for $75, $60, or a tea gown for $90 or $110. But in fact, I had a very interesting talk with Dior on that subject with Jack Rouet. You know, they used to have the ready-to-wear business, which I referred to before, operating from the then Heckscher building, Genesco building, and it was not particularly successful. Those clothes were made in Paris, and they were quite high priced. And one of the reasons it wasn't successful is that any manufacturer could go in and buy a dress at Dior, and he could make it for $30, $40, $50. There was no control on that at all. And then they started doing a Miss Dior line with David Crystal, and we had it in Miss Bergdorf, and it did very well. The name was still Magic Dior, because it hadn't been exploited so much at that time. And we did well with it, and
Are we done?